diet he could stomach, and began to twitter very seriously at him, while pointing to various objects, parts of their bodies, the walls around them, and Weaver himself. After a while, Weaver grasped the idea that he was being instructed. He was willing to cooperate, but he did not suppose for a moment that he could master the bird-like sounds they made. Instead, he took an old envelope and a stub of pencil from his pocket and wrote the English word for each thing they pointed out. Orange, he wrote. It was not an orange, but the color was the same at any rate. Thorax, wall, man, mandibles. In the afternoon they brought a machine with staring lenses and bright lights. Weaver guessed that he was being televised. He put a hand on the nearest bug thing's shoulder and smiled for his audience. Later, after he had eaten again, they went on with the language lesson. Now it was Weaver who taught and they who learned. This, Weaver felt, was as it should be. These creatures were not men, he told himself. He would give himself no illusions on that score, but they might still be capable of learning many things that he had to teach. He could do a great deal of good, even if it turned out that he could never return to Earth. He rather suspected they had no spaceships. There was something about their life, the small villages, the slowly drifting air cars, the absence of noise and smell and dirt, that somehow it did not fit with the idea of space travel. As soon as he was able, he asked them about it. No, they had never traveled beyond their own planet. It was a great marvel. Perhaps he could teach them how sometime. As their command of written English improved, he catechized them about themselves and their planet. The world, as he knew already, was much like Earth as to atmosphere, gravity, and mean temperature. It occurred to him briefly that he had been lucky to hit upon such a world, but the thought did not stick. He had no way of knowing just how improbable his luck had been. They themselves were, as he had thought, simple beings. They had a written history of some 12,000 of their years, which he estimated to be about 9,000 of his. Their technical accomplishments, he had to grant, equaled Earth's and in some cases surpassed them. Their social organization was either so complex that it escaped him altogether, or unbelievably simple. They did not, so far as he could discover, have any political divisions. They did not make war. They were egg layers, and they controlled their population simply by means of hatching only as many eggs as were needed to replace their natural losses. Just when it first struck Weaver that he was their appointed ruler, it would be hard to say. It began perhaps that afternoon in the air car, or a few days later when he made his first timid request for a house of his own. The request was eagerly granted, and he was asked how he would like the house constructed. Half timidly he drew sketches of his own suburban home in Schenectady, and they built it, swarms of them working together, down to the hardwood floors and the pneumatic furniture and the picture moldings and the lampshades. Or perhaps the idea crystallized when he asked to see some of their native dances, and within an hour the dancers assembled on his lawn, 500 of them, and performed until sundown. At any rate, nothing could have been more clearly correct once he had grasped the idea. He was a man, alone in a world of outlandish creatures. It was natural that he should lead. Indeed, it was his duty. They were poor things, but they were malleable in his hands. It was a great adventure. Who knew how far he might not bring them? Weaver embarked on a tour of the planet, taking with him 2 of the bug things as guides and a third as pilot and personal servant. Their names in their own tongue he had not bothered to ask. He had christened them Mark, Luke, and John. All 3 now wrote and read English with fair proficiency. Thus Weaver was well served. The trip was entirely enjoyable. He was met everywhere by the same throngs, the same delight and enthusiasm as before, and between villages there seemed to be nothing on the planet that could be called a city. The rolling green countryside, dotted with bouquets of yellow and orange flowered trees, was most soothing to the eye. Weaver noted the varieties of strangely shaped and colored plants, and the swarms of bright flying things, and began an abortive collection. He had to give it up for the present. There were too many things to study. He looked forward to a few books to be compiled later, when he had time, for the guidance of Earthmen at some future date. The flora of Terra Nova, the fauna of Terra Nova. All that was in the distant future. Now he was chiefly concerned with the Terra Novans themselves, how they lived, what they thought, what sort of primitive religion they had, and so on. He asked endless questions of his guides, and through them of the villagers they met. And the more he learned, the more agitated he became. "But this is monstrous," he wrote indignantly to Mark and Luke. They had just visited a house inhabited by 17 males and 12 females. Weaver was now beginning to be able to distinguish the sexes, and he had inquired what their relations were. Mark had informed him calmly that they were husbands and wives, and when Weaver pointed out that the balance was uneven, had written, "No, not 1 to 1, all to all husband and wife of each other." Mark held Weaver's indignant message up to his eyes with one many-jointed claw, while his other 3 forelimbs gestured uncertainly. Finally he seized the notepad and wrote, "Do not understand monstrous. Please forgive. They do for more change, so not to make each other have tiredness." Weaver frowned and wrote, "Does not your religion forbid this?" Mark consulted in his own piping tongue with the other 2. Finally he surrendered the notepad to Luke, who wrote, "Do not understand religion to forbid. Please excuse. With us many religion. Some say spirits in flower, some say in wind and sun, some say in ground. Not say to do this, not to do that. With us all people the same. No one tell other what to do." Weaver added another mental note to his already lengthy list. Build churches. He wrote, "Tell them this must stop." Mark turned without hesitation to the silently attentive group and translated. He turned back to Weaver and wrote, "They ask please what to do now instead of the way they do." Weaver told him they must mate only 1 to 1, and for life. To his surprise, the translation of this was greeted by unmistakable twitterings of gladness. The members of the adulterous group turned to each other with excited gestures, and Weaver saw a pairing off process begin with much discussion. He asked Mark about it later as they were leaving the village. "How is it that they did this thing before, for more variety as you say, and yet seem so glad to stop?" Mark's answer was, "They very glad to do whatever thing you say. You bring them new thing. They are very happy." Weaver mused on this contentedly on the whole, but with a small undigested kernel of uneasiness, until they reached the next village. Here he found a crowd of Terranovans of both sexes and all ages at a feast of something with a fearful stench. He asked what it was. Mark's answer had better not be revealed. Feeling genuinely sick with revulsion, Weaver demanded, "Why do they do such an awful thing? This is 10 times worse than the other." This time Mark answered without hesitation, "They do this like the other, for more change. It is not easy to learn to like, but they do, so not to make themselves have tiredness." There were 3 more such incidents before they reached the village where they were to sleep that night, and Weaver lay awake in his downy bed, staring at the faint shimmer of reflected starlight on the carved roof beams, and meditating soberly on the unexpected, the appalling magnitude of the task he had set for himself. From this he came to consider that small dark kernel of doubt. It was of course dreadful to find that his people were so wholly corrupt, but that at least was understandable. What he did not understand was the reason they could be so easily weaned from their wickedness. It left him feeling a little off balance, like a man who has hurled himself at his enemy and found him suddenly not there. This reminded him of jiu-jitsu, and this in turn of the ancient Japanese, to whom indeed his Terranovans seemed to have many resemblances. Weaver's uneasiness increased. Savage peoples were notoriously devious. They smiled and then thrust knives between your ribs. He felt a sudden prickling coldness at the thought. It was improbable, it was fantastic, that they would go to such lengths to gratify his every wish if they meant to kill him, he told himself. And then he remembered the Dionysian rites, and a host of other too similar parallels. The king for a day or a year, who ruled as an absolute monarch and then was sacrificed. And Weaver remembered with a stab of panic, usually eaten. He had been on Terra Nova for a little over a month by the local calendar. What was his term of office to be? 2 months? 6? A year? 10 years? He slept little that night, woke late in the morning with dry, irritated eyes and a furred mouth, and spent a silent day inspecting each new batch of natives without comment, and shivering inwardly at each motion of the clawed arms of Mark, Luke, or John. Toward the evening he came out of his funk at last, when it occurred to him to ask about weapons. He put the query slyly, wording it as if it were a matter of general interest only, and of no great importance. Were they familiar with machines that killed, and if so, what varieties did they have? At first Mark did not understand the question. He replied that their machines did not kill, that